I found my son sitting on a park bench with my 6-year-old grandson and 3 designer suitcases. I pulled my rusted Ford truck up to the curb and rolled down the window. I asked him, "Why aren't you at work?" He looked up at me with eyes red from crying and said, "I got fired." My father-in-law said our bloodline was not worthy. I did not scream, I did not get out and rage. I simply unlocked the passenger door and said, "Get in the car." It was time he found out who the real boss was. If you have ever been looked down upon by people who think money buys class, hit that like button and subscribe. My name is Warren. I am 70 years old. To the world, and even to my own son, I am just a retired maintenance worker who lives in a small house on the edge of town. I drive a truck that is 20 years old. I wear flannel shirts that have seen better days. I clip coupons for the grocery store. But what nobody knows, what I have kept hidden for 40 years to protect my family from the corruption of wealth, is that I am the founder and majority shareholder of Titan Holdings. I own the industrial parks where my son's father-in-law rents his warehouses. I own the land under his country club. I could buy his entire existence with a single phone call. But today, seeing my son broken on a park bench, I realized that my silence had gone on too long. The October wind was biting as I stepped out of the truck. The leaves were turning brown and swirling around the wheels of my old Ford. My son Leo was shivering. He was wearing his expensive suit, the one he wore to his job as the chief operating officer of Harrington Luxury, but he looked like a lost child. Next to him, my grandson Toby was hugging a teddy bear, looking confused and scared. The contrast was sharp. The gleaming Louis Vuitton suitcases stacked on the dirty concrete symbols of a life that had just rejected them. I walked over and put a hand on Leo's shoulder. He flinched. He looked up at me, and the shame in his eyes broke my heart. I asked him again calmly what happened. Leo wiped his face with the back of his hand. He told me that Richard, his father-in-law, had called him into the office this morning. There was a discrepancy in the financial reports. Richard wanted Leo to sign off on a falsified earnings report to secure a new loan. Leo refused. He told Richard it was fraud. Leo's voice trembled as he recounted the next part. He said Richard laughed. Richard stood up, walked around his mahogany desk, and told Leo that he was useless. He said that honesty is a luxury for the wealthy, and that Leo did not have the pedigree to understand how business works. Richard told him that he was just the son of a janitor, that his bloodline was destined to scrub floors, not sit in boardrooms. Then he fired him. But it did not end there. Richard told him to get out of the house. He said that the mansion belonged to the Harrington Trust, and since Leo was no longer an employee, he was trespassing. I looked at Toby. He was quiet, too quiet for a 6-year-old. I asked Leo where Rachel was. Where was his wife while her father was throwing her husband and child onto the street? Leo looked down at his polished shoes. He said she was there. She stood by the window. She was crying, but she did not say a word. Richard told her that if she left with Leo, she would be cut out of the will. She stayed. She let her father evict her husband and her son because she was afraid of losing her credit cards. I felt a cold rage settle in my stomach. It was a familiar feeling, one I had not felt since I was building my empire in the 80s, crushing competitors who tried to cheat me. But I kept my face impassive. I did not let the anger show. I grabbed the handle of the heaviest suitcase. I told Leo to grab Toby. "We are going home." Leo hesitated. He looked at my old truck, then at the mountain of luggage. He asked where we were going. I told him we were going to my house. He looked worried. He whispered that my house was small, that it was not set up for a child, that it was in a bad neighborhood. I stopped and looked him in the eye. I told him that a home is not defined by the square footage or the zip code. A home is where you are safe, and right now you are not safe anywhere else. We loaded the truck in silence. The expensive leather of their luggage scratched against the rusted metal of my truck bed. It was a fitting metaphor. The veneer of their high society life was being stripped away, revealing the brutal reality underneath. As I drove away from the park, I looked in the rearview mirror. Leo was holding Toby, staring out the window at the gray sky. He looked defeated. He thought his life was over. He thought he had lost everything. He had no idea that he was sitting next to a man who could buy and sell Richard Harrington 10 times over. The drive to my house took 40 minutes. We left the manicured lawns and gated communities of the city center and entered the working-class suburbs. The houses here were small, the paint was peeling, and the fences were chain link. Leo had not visited me here often. Rachel hated coming here. She said it smelled like old people in poverty. Leo usually met me at a diner halfway between our worlds. Now he was coming to live here. I pulled into the driveway. My house is a simple single-story structure with a small porch. The siding is faded yellow. The grass is overgrown because my arthritis has been acting up. I saw Leo wince as we got out. He was already thinking about how he had failed his son, how he had dragged him from a mansion to a shack. I unlocked the front door and ushered them inside. The air inside smelled of dust and old coffee. It was clean, but it was sparse. I have lived like a monk since my wife passed away. I told Leo to put the bags in the guest room. It was really just a storage room with a pull-out couch. I saw Toby looking around, his eyes wide. He asked where his room was. Leo choked back a sob and told him that this was an adventure like camping. I went to the kitchen to make coffee. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing. I needed a plan. I needed to teach Richard a lesson, but more importantly, I needed to teach Leo a lesson. I needed my son to find his backbone. I made a simple dinner that night. Grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup from a can. We sat at my small Formica kitchen table. The silence was heavy. The only sound was the scraping of spoons against bowls. Leo barely ate. He kept checking his phone, hoping for a message from Rachel, hoping she would come to her senses and call him back. But the phone remained dark. Halfway through the meal, Leo finally spoke. He asked me what he was going to do. He said he had no savings. Richard and Rachel had always managed the money. They lived a lifestyle that consumed every dollar he earned. The cars, the vacations, the private school tuitions, it was all tied to the Harrington money. He said he had nothing. I took a bite of my sandwich and chewed slowly. I told him he had his health. He had his son. He had a roof over his head. That is not nothing. That is a foundation. Leo shook his head. He said I did not understand. He said Richard was powerful. He had lawyers. He had connections. He would make sure Leo never worked in this town again. I almost laughed. Richard thought he had power because he had his face on billboards and threw charity galas. He did not know what real power was. Real power is silent. Real power is having leverage that no one knows about. The phone rang then. It was a harsh, jarring sound in the quiet kitchen. Leo jumped. He grabbed it, looking at the screen. His face went pale. He answered it on speaker. It was a man's voice, slick and professional. It was the Harrington family lawyer. "Mr. Vance," the voice said, "I am calling to inform you that your joint bank accounts have been frozen pending a forensic audit. Mr. Harrington has filed a motion claiming misappropriation of company funds. Until the investigation is complete, you will not have access to any assets. Furthermore, we will be filing for emergency custody of the minor child, Toby, based on your lack of housing and financial stability." Leo dropped the phone on the table. The call ended. He put his head in his hands and began to sob. It was a raw, ugly sound. The sound of a man who has been stripped of his dignity. He cried that they were going to take Toby. He cried that he had no money to hire a lawyer. He cried that he was going to jail for a fraud he did not commit. I watched him. I felt a fierce protectiveness rise up in me, but I also felt disappointment. I had raised him to be kind, to be gentle, but somewhere along the way he had become soft. He had let the Harringtons declaw him. He had traded his self-respect for a comfortable life, and now the bill was due. I stood up and walked over to him. I put my hand on the back of his neck and squeezed. I told him to stop crying. I told him that tears would not save his son. I told him that Richard wanted him to break. He wanted him to crawl back and beg. "Is that what you are going to do?" I asked. "Are you going to crawl?" Leo looked up at me. His face was wet. His eyes were swollen. He asked me what choice he had. He said he was fighting a giant with bare hands. I smiled then. It was a cold, hard smile. I told him that sometimes the giant is standing on a trapdoor, and all you have to do is pull the lever. I cleared the table. I told Leo to put Toby to bed. I told him to try to sleep, because tomorrow was going to be a long day. He asked me what we were going to do tomorrow. I told him we were going to get Toby's things. We were going to go back to that mansion and look Richard in the eye. Leo looked terrified. He said we couldn't go back. Richard had threatened to call the police. I told him let him call the police. I told him that a man does not leave his son's favorite toys behind. I told him that if he wanted to keep Toby, he had to show the court and Richard and Rachel that he was not afraid. Leo took Toby into the back room. I could hear him whispering to the boy, trying to explain why they were sleeping on a lumpy couch in a house that smelled like old paper. I washed the dishes in the sink. The water was lukewarm because I keep the water heater setting low to save money. I looked out the window at the dark street. I dried my hands on a ragged towel and reached into my pocket. I pulled out an old Nokia phone, a burner phone I keep for one specific purpose. I dialed a number I had not called in 5 years. It rang twice. A woman's voice answered. She sounded sharp, alert, even though it was late. She said, "Mr. Fitzgerald, it has been a long time." I said, "Hello, Catherine. I need you to reactivate the active duty protocols. I need a full dossier on Harrington Luxury. Debts, liabilities, shadow partners, everything. And Catherine, clear my schedule for tomorrow morning. I am coming into the city." There was a pause on the other end. Then she asked, "Are we acquiring a new asset, sir?" I looked at the closed door of the guest room where my son and grandson were sleeping. I said, "No, Catherine. We are not acquiring an asset. We are going to war." I hung up the phone and sat in my armchair. The leather was cracked and the springs squeaked. I closed my eyes. I thought about Richard Harrington. I thought about the way he must be celebrating right now, drinking his expensive scotch, thinking he had crushed a nuisance. He thought he had discarded a piece of trash. He did not know he had just lit the fuse on a bomb. The next morning, the sun rose gray and dull over the neighborhood. I woke up at 5 as I always do. I made a pot of strong coffee. I sat on the porch and watched the stray cats fight over scraps in the alley. It was a stark difference from the view Leo was used to. He was used to waking up to views of manicured gardens and swimming pools. Today, he would wake up to the sound of the garbage truck and the reality of his new life. Leo came out of the room at 7. He looked like he hadn't slept. His suit was wrinkled. He hadn't shaved. He looked defeated. I handed him a mug of black coffee. I told him to drink it. I told him we were leaving in 30 minutes. He asked where we were going. I told him we were going to the Harrington estate. He started to protest. He said it was suicide. He said Richard would humiliate us again. I told him that humiliation is a choice. You can only be humiliated if you accept their judgment of you. I told him to wash his face and stand up straight. We got into the truck. The engine coughed and sputtered before roaring to life. It was a loud, ugly sound. Leo shrank down in the passenger seat. He was embarrassed to be seen in this vehicle. I drove us out of the neighborhood and onto the highway. We headed back toward the wealthy district. As we drove, I asked Leo about the business. Not the surface-level stuff, but the operations. I asked him about the supply chains, the vendor contracts, the debt structuring. At first, he was confused. He gave me simple answers, thinking I wouldn't understand the complexities of corporate finance. But I kept pushing. I asked specific questions about leverage ratios and liquidity. Slowly, Leo started to talk. He knew his stuff. He was a good operator. He knew where the bodies were buried in that company. He told me that Harrington Luxury was overextended. They had expanded too fast into the Asian market. The inventory was sitting in warehouses unsold. The cash flow was drying up. Richard was using new loans to pay off old interest. It was a Ponzi scheme wrapped in silk. I nodded as I drove. This was good intelligence. Richard was vulnerable. He was projecting strength, but he was bleeding out. The eviction of Leo wasn't just about bloodlines or snobbery. It was about panic. Richard needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to pin the financial irregularities on so he could present a clean face to the banks. Leo was the perfect sacrifice. We pulled up to the gates of the Harrington estate. It was a monstrosity of a house, all columns and marble screaming for attention. I pressed the intercom button. A voice crackled through. It was the house manager. He asked who it was. I said, "It is Warren and Leo. We are here for the boys' things." The voice said, "Mr. Harrington left strict instructions. You are not allowed on the property." I leaned out the window and spoke into the box. I said, "You tell Richard that if he doesn't open this gate in 10 seconds, I am going to drive this truck through it. And I don't think his insurance covers acts of God or angry grandfathers." There was silence. Leo looked at me with horror. He said, "Dad, are you crazy? You can't ram the gate." I looked at him. I said, "Watch me." I shifted the truck into low gear and revved the engine. The old Ford rumbled like a beast waking up. I inched forward until the bumper was touching the wrought iron. Suddenly, the gate buzzed and began to swing open. Bullies are all the same. They only respect force. I drove up the long driveway, oil dripping from my engine onto their pristine pavers. I parked right in front of the main entrance, blocking the path of Richard's Bentley. Richard came out the front door. He was wearing a silk robe and holding a coffee cup. He looked furious. Rachel was behind him, looking pale and frightened. Richard shouted, "Get that piece of junk off my driveway. What do you think you're doing?" I stepped out of the truck. I wore my faded jeans and my work boots. I walked up to him. I am a head shorter than him, but in that moment I felt 10 feet tall. I said, "We are here for Toby's things, all of them, and we are not leaving until we have them." Richard sneered. He looked at Leo, who had gotten out of the truck and was standing by the door, looking ready to bolt. Richard said, "Look at you, crawling back with your daddy. I told you you are garbage. You don't belong here." He gestured to the side of the house. There was a pile of black trash bags sitting in the dirt. He said, "There is your stuff. I had the maids bag it up. Take it and get out before I call the sheriff." I looked at the bags. I saw the leg of Toby's favorite teddy bear sticking out of one. It was covered in mud. Richard had thrown his grandson's toys in the dirt like refuse. I felt a vein throb in my temple. I walked over to the bags. I picked up the bear and dusted it off. I walked back to Richard. I stood very close to him. I could smell his expensive cologne covering up the scent of fear sweat. I said, "You made a mistake, Richard. You think money makes you untouchable. You think because I drive a truck and live in a small house that I am beneath you." Richard laughed. He said, "You are beneath me. You are a nobody, a peasant. Take your trash son and leave." I nodded slowly. I said, "Okay, we are leaving. But remember this moment, Richard. Remember the way you feel right now. Powerful, superior, because it is the last time you will ever feel this way. I turned to Leo. I told him to load the bags. Leo hurried to obey, keeping his head down. Rachel stepped forward, tears in her eyes. She whispered, "Leo, I'm sorry. Daddy says it has to be this way." Leo paused. He looked at his wife. For the first time, I saw a spark of anger in his eyes. He said, "You are a mother, Rachel. That is your son's bear in the mud, and you let him do it. Don't say you're sorry. Say you're a coward." He threw the last bag in the truck and got in. I walked back to the driver's side. Richard yelled after us, "Don't come back. Next time I'll have the dogs release on you." I got in the truck and backed out, leaving tire marks on his lawn. As we drove down the driveway, Leo was shaking. He was adrenaline dumping. He said, "Dad, he's going to come for us. He's going to destroy us." I reached into the glove box and pulled out a cigar. I don't smoke often, only when I have closed a deal or started a war. I lit it and took a puff. I said, "No, son. He isn't going to destroy us. He just handed us the weapon to destroy him." We drove back to my house in silence. But it was a different silence than the night before. The air had changed. The first shot had been fired. When we got back, there was a police cruiser parked in front of my house. Leo panicked. He said, "They called the cops. They're going to arrest me." 2 officers stepped out. They weren't there to arrest Leo. They were holding a piece of paper, a court order. The officer asked, "Are you?" Leo Vance. Leo nodded, terrified. The officer said, "We have an emergency removal order for the minor child Toby Vance. Mr. Harrington has been granted temporary emergency custody based on allegations of kidnapping and unsafe living conditions. You need to hand the child over immediately." Toby ran out of the house, then hearing the voices. He saw the police and grabbed Leo's leg. He started screaming, "No, I don't want to go, Daddy. Don't let them take me." Leo fell to his knees. He hugged his son. He looked up at the officers, begging. He said, "Please, he is my son. You can't take him. We just got here." The officer looked sympathetic but firm. He said, "It's a court order, sir. If you don't comply, we will have to use force and arrest you. Please don't make this harder on the boy." I stood on the porch. I watched my son crying, holding onto his child. I watched the police peeling his fingers off the boy's shirt. I watched them put my screaming grandson into the back of the patrol car. It was the lowest moment of Leo's life. He collapsed on the dirt of my front yard, sobbing into the grass. He was broken. I walked down the steps. I did not comfort him. I did not hug him. I grabbed him by the collar of his ruined suit, and I hauled him up to his feet. I slapped him across the face. It wasn't hard, but it was enough to snap his head back. He looked at me, shocked into silence. I said, "Stop it. Stop crying. You are done crying. They took your son. They took your dignity. Now are you going to lay in the dirt and die, or are you going to stand up and fight?" Leo stared at me. His lip was bleeding. He breathed heavily. The shock was turning into something else. Rage. I pulled my burner phone out of my pocket. I dialed Catherine again. I said, "Catherine, initiate Project Titan. I want a meeting with the board of directors. And get the helicopter ready. I am coming to the tower." Leo looked at me confused. He asked Dad, "Who are you calling?" "What tower?" I looked at my son. I straightened my flannel shirt. I said, "Go wash your face and put on your tie, Leo. We aren't going to the unemployment office. We are going to the headquarters of Titan Holdings, and I am going to introduce you to the chairman." Leo asked, "You know the chairman of Titan Holdings?" "Opened the door of the truck," I said. "Son, I am the chairman of Titan Holdings. Get in the car. It is time to go to work." The morning sun did not bring warmth. It only brought a harsh light to the reality of our situation as I steered my 20-year-old Ford truck back toward the zip code that pretended I did not exist. The engine rattled with a rhythmic coughing sound, a stark contrast to the purring electric sedans and imported sports cars that lined the streets of the Harrington estate. Beside me in the passenger seat, Leo sat with his hands clenched in his lap, his knuckles white, his eyes fixed on the dashboard. We were not going back for money or for an apology. We were going back because in the chaos of the eviction, Richard had kept Toby's school backpack and his asthma inhaler and Leo's laptop, which contained his entire professional portfolio. They were holding my grandson's health and my son's career hostage, and we had to beg for them back. I glanced at Leo and saw a man who was vibrating with a mixture of terror and shame. He adjusted the collar of the flannel shirt I had lent him because his suits were crumpled in a pile on my living room floor. He looked like he was going to his execution. He asked me quietly, "Dad, do you think she will be there?" He did not have to say her name. I knew he meant Rachel. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, feeling the worn leather under my calloused palms. I told him that if she was there, she would likely be standing behind her father, because that is where cowards usually stand. We approached the wrought iron gates of the Harrington mansion, and the guard on duty stepped out of his booth with a look of disdain that must have been part of his job description. He did not open the gate. He simply stood there with his arms crossed, tapping a clipboard. I rolled down the window, and the smell of freshly cut grass and money drifted in. I told the guard we were here for the rest of my grandson's things, as arranged. The guard smirked and said, "Mr. Harrington is expecting you, but you cannot bring that vehicle inside." He said there is a homeowner association rule about commercial trucks and unsightly vehicles. He told us we had to park on the street and walk up the driveway. It was a power move designed to make us feel small before we even set foot on the property. Leo looked like he wanted to argue, but I put a hand on his arm. I turned off the ignition and opened the door. I told Leo to walk with his head up. I told him that walking is good for the soul, and that we would walk up that driveway like we owned the pavement beneath our boots. We left the truck on the public road, a rusted blemish on their perfect landscape, and began the long trek up the winding path to the main house. The walk was agonizingly long. The driveway was lined with imported Italian cypress trees that stood like silent sentinels judging our unworthy clothes. As we crested the hill, the mansion came into view, a sprawling testament to ego built of white marble and glass. And there, waiting for us on the front steps like a king greeting peasants, was Richard Harrington. He was wearing a white linen suit that probably cost more than my house. He held a glass of iced tea in one hand and a golf club in the other, practicing his swing as if our arrival was nothing more than a minor interruption to his leisure. But what stopped me cold was not Richard. It was the pile on the gravel driveway. It was not a neat stack of boxes. It was a mountain of black garbage bags, some of them split open, spilling their contents onto the dusty ground. I saw my grandson's colorful drawings fluttering in the wind. I saw Leo's college diploma in its frame with the glass cracked. I saw clothes and shoes and toys mixed together like refuse at a landfill. Richard stopped his swing and looked at us. He took a slow sip of his tea and smiled. He called out across the lawn saying, "Look who decided to show up." The help told me there was a vagrant walking up the driveway, but I told them no, that is just my former son-in-law and his father. He laughed at his own joke, a dry hacking sound that grated on my nerves. Leo stopped walking. He stared at the pile of trash that contained his life. He whispered, "Look what they did." I could hear the tears in his voice, but I nudged him forward. I told him to keep moving. I told him, "Do not let him see you bleed." We walked until we were standing 10 feet from the steps. The distance was deliberate. Richard stood above us, looking down from his marble perch, forcing us to look up at him into the sun. Richard used the head of his golf club to poke at a bag near his feet. He said I had the maids clear out the guest wing. "We need to fumigate. You know how hard it is to get the smell of poverty out of Egyptian cotton sheets." He looked directly at me, then his eyes cold and dead. He said, "You should be thanking me, Warren." I am returning your son to his natural habitat. You people are not built for this altitude. The air up here is too thin for lungs used to breathing factory smoke. I did not speak. I simply stared at him, memorizing every line on his face, every arrogant twitch of his mouth. I was recording this moment in the ledger of my mind, where debts are kept. Leo stepped forward, his voice trembling but audible. He asked where Toby's medicine was. He said, "We just want the inhaler and the laptop, and we will leave." Richard feigned surprise. He looked around the scattered pile of debris. He said, "Oh, is that what you are looking for? I think I saw the dog playing with something plastic earlier. Or maybe it is in that bag over there, the one that ripped open when the gardener threw it." He pointed with the golf club to a bag that had spilled onto the wet grass near the sprinklers. Leo ran to the bag. He fell to his knees, frantically digging through the wet clothes and broken toys. It was a humiliating sight. My son, a man with a master's degree, a man who had run operations for this monster, kneeling in the mud, scavenging for his child's medicine, while his father-in-law watched with amusement. I stood my ground. I did not help Leo search. I kept my eyes on the house. I was looking for something specific. I was scanning the windows, the dark panes of glass that reflected the sky. And then I saw her. On the second floor, in the window of the master bedroom, the curtains parted slightly. A face appeared. It was Rachel. She looked pale. Her hair was unkempt. She was watching her husband on his knees in the dirt. Our eyes locked for a second. I expected to see defiance or anger, but what I saw was fear. She looked terrified. But she did not move. She did not open the window. She did not run down the stairs to stop her father. She simply watched like a spectator at a gladiator match, waiting to see who would die. Leo found the inhaler. He clutched it to his chest and stood up, wiping the mud from his knees. He looked up at the window too. He saw her. He took a step toward the house and called out her name. He shouted, "Rachel, please. This is insane. Talk to me. We can fix this. Just come outside." The curtain moved. For a heartbeat, I thought she would turn away, but she stayed there looking down. Richard turned and followed Leo's gaze. He saw his daughter in the window. He chuckled darkly. He said, "Save your breath, boy. She knows better than to associate with failed investments. She is a Harrington. We cut our losses. We do not throw good money after bad. And you, Leo, are a very bad investment." Leo looked at Richard, then back at the window. He shouted again, louder this time, his voice cracking with desperation. He asked her how she could let this happen. He asked her if she cared about Toby. He asked her if the last 7 years meant anything at all. Rachel placed her hand on the glass. It was a ghostly gesture. Then slowly, painfully, she closed the curtains. The white fabric slid shut, erasing her from view. It was more final than a slamming door. It was the silence of total abandonment. Leo stood there stunned. The rejection was physical. He swayed on his feet. Richard clapped his hands together, mocking applause. He said, "Bravo. A touching performance. But now that we have established that nobody here wants you, it is time for you to take your trash and get off my property." I walked over to the pile. I saw something half buried in the dirt. It was a small brown teddy bear with one eye missing. It was Toby's favorite, the one he slept with every night. It was lying face down in a puddle of muddy water from the sprinkler system. I bent down. My knees cracked, but I did not wince. I picked up the bear. I brushed the mud off its fur with my hand. I squeezed the water out of it. I walked up the steps until I was eye level with Richard. The golf club was still in his hand, but he took a half step back. He did not like the look in my eyes. I was not screaming. I was not crying. I was calm. It was the calm of the deep ocean before a tsunami. I held up the bear. I said, "Richard, you have made a calculation. You have added up the bank accounts and the cars and the houses, and you think the sum of your worth is greater than ours. You think this makes you strong. You think throwing a child's toy in the mud makes you a king. Richard sneered, trying to regain his composure. He said, "Spare me the working-class philosophy, Warren. Get your truck and your son and get out." I continued as if he had not spoken. I said, "You have forgotten one variable in your calculation. You have forgotten that a man who has nothing to lose is the most dangerous man on earth. And you have just stripped my son of everything he thought he had to lose. You did not break him, Richard. You just freed him." Richard's face turned red. The veins in his neck bulged. He pointed the golf club at my chest. He shouted, "Get off my land! If I see that rust bucket truck anywhere near my estate again, I will call the sheriff and have you both arrested for trespassing and harassment. I will have restraining orders issued. I will make sure you never see your grandson again. Now take your garbage and go." I looked at the golf club aimed at my heart. I looked at the man holding it. A man hollowed out by greed and propped up by debt. I smiled. It was a small, cold smile. I lowered the teddy bear. I turned my back on him. It was the ultimate insult. I did not fear him enough to walk backwards. I went to Leo. I put my arm around his shoulders. He was still staring at the closed window. I told him, "Let's go, son. We have what we came for." We gathered the bags. It took us 3 trips to carry everything down the long driveway to the truck. Richard watched us the entire time, drinking his tea, making sure we did not steal any of his gravel. We threw the wet, muddy bags into the bed of the Ford. Leo climbed into the passenger seat. He looked broken. He looked like a man whose soul had been crushed. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. As we pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Richard was still standing on the porch, a tiny white figure against the massive house. He looked victorious. But as I shifted gears, I felt a vibration in my pocket. It was my burner phone. I ignored it. I knew who it was. It was Catherine. The dossier on Harrington Luxury was ready. The weapon was loaded. Leo sat silently for a long time, hugging the muddy teddy bear. Finally, he spoke. He asked me, "Dad, why did you let him talk to us like that? Why didn't you do anything? You just let him win." I kept my eyes on the road. We were passing the manicured hedges and the stone walls of the gated community. I said, "Son, he did not win. He just showed us his hand. He thinks we are playing poker, and he has the aces. He does not know we are playing chess, and I have already moved my queen." Leo shook his head. He said, "You don't understand, Dad. He is going to call the police. He is going to keep Toby. He has money. We have nothing. We are going back to your house to eat canned soup while he drinks champagne." I reached over and patted his knee. I said, "Listen to me, Leo. The humiliation you felt today, burn it into your memory. The way he looked at you. The way Rachel closed the curtains. The mud on this bear. Do not forget it. Use it. Because very soon the tables are going to turn. And when they do, I want you to remember that mercy is a gift you give to those who deserve it. And Richard Harrington deserves none." We drove in silence for the rest of the trip, but the air in the truck was heavy with the promise of a storm. We had the bear. We had the inhaler. But we had left something behind at that mansion. We had left Leo's innocence, and we had left my patience. When we arrived back at my small house, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. I parked the truck. We began to unload the bags again, dragging them into the small living room. The smell of the mud from the Harrington estate seemed to fill my house, a scent of disrespect that I could not scrub away. I went to the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water. I handed one to Leo. He drank it in one gulp. He looked at me, his eyes red and swollen. He asked, "What do we do now, Dad?" "We can't fight him. He's right. Our bloodline. Maybe we just aren't meant to win." I slammed my glass down on the table. The sound made Leo jump. I looked at him with a fire that I had been suppressing all day. I said, "Do not ever say that again. Your bloodline is not weak. Your bloodline built this country. Your bloodline survives." Suddenly there was a loud pounding on the front door. It was aggressive, authoritative. Leo froze. He whispered, "Who is that?" I walked to the door. I knew it wasn't a neighbor. I opened it. 2 police officers stood there, along with a woman in a suit holding a clipboard. Behind them, parked on the street, was a sleek black car that I recognized immediately. It was the private security detail for the Harrington family. The officer stepped forward. He asked, "Are you Warren Fitzgerald?" I said, "I am." He said, "We have a report of a disturbance at the Harrington estate, and we have a court order for the immediate removal of the child Toby Vance into the custody of his mother, Rachel Harrington." Leo let out a sound that was not human. It was the cry of a wounded animal. He ran to the door, trying to push past me. He shouted, "No, you can't take him! He is my son!" The officer put a hand on his holster. He said, "Sir, step back. We have a judge's signature. The child is considered to be in imminent danger in this environment." I looked past the officer at the black car. The window rolled down just an inch. I saw Richard's eyes peering out. He had followed us. He had come to watch the final twist of the knife. He had come to watch them take my grandson. I turned to Leo. I grabbed his shoulders. I said, "Leo, go get Toby. Do not make a scene. Do not traumatize the boy. Bring him here." Leo looked at me with betrayal in his eyes. He said, "Dad, you are letting them take him." I leaned in close. I whispered so only he could hear. I said, "I am not letting them take him. I am letting them make the biggest mistake of their lives. I am letting them kidnap a child under false pretenses while I have the evidence to prove it. Go get the boy." Leo went to the back room. He came out carrying Toby, who was crying and clutching the muddy bear we had just retrieved. Leo handed his son to the social worker. He kissed Toby's forehead. He whispered, "Daddy loves you. I will come for you. I promise." We watched them put Toby in the car. We watched the police officers get into their cruiser. We watched the black car with Richard inside pull away, leading the convoy. They took the only light in our lives and drove it into the darkness. Leo collapsed on the porch steps. He put his head in his hands and wept. He was broken. He was finished. I stood over him. I watched the taillights disappear. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the burner phone. I dialed Catherine. She answered on the first ring. She said, "Sir, the dossier is complete. It is worse than we thought. Richard is leveraging the company assets to pay for personal gambling debts. He is technically insolvent." I said, "Good. Catherine, I want you to initiate the acquisition. Buy the debt. Buy the loans. Buy the mortgage on his house. Buy it all." She asked, "When do we execute the takeover?" I looked down at my son weeping in the dirt. I looked at the empty street where my grandson had just been stolen. I said, "We execute it tomorrow night. He is hosting a charity gala to raise capital. He thinks he is going to save his company." I paused. My voice dropped to a whisper that was colder than the grave. I said, "Catherine, prepare the helicopter and tell the board to meet me at the tower. I am coming out of retirement." I hung up the phone. I looked at Leo. I kicked his shoe gently. I said, "Get up, Leo. Stop crying. We have work to do." He looked up at me confused. He asked, "What work, Dad?" "We lost." I smiled. And this time it wasn't a cold smile. It was the smile of a wolf who has just cornered a rabbit. I said, "We didn't lose son. We just cleared the battlefield. Get inside." I am going to show you what your bloodline is really worth. The silence in my living room was not peaceful. It was the suffocating quiet of a tomb before the stone is rolled away. We had just brought the bags inside, the smell of the mud from Richard's estate still clinging to our clothes, when the flashing lights cut through my thin curtains. Red and blue strobes painted the peeling yellow walls of my house, turning the dust motes in the air into a chaotic dance of color. I knew they were coming, but knowing an avalanche is coming does not make the impact any less crushing. I looked at Leo. He was holding a glass of water, his hand trembling so badly the liquid was splashing over the rim onto his ruined suit pants. He looked at the window, his eyes wide with the primal fear of a hunted animal. He whispered, "Dad, they are here." I did not have to ask who. I walked to the door, my boots heavy on the floorboards. I opened it, and the night air rushed in cold and smelling of ozone and exhaust. 2 police cruisers were parked at erratic angles on my lawn, their tires crushing the overgrown grass I had been meaning to cut. Behind them sat a black town car, sleek and menacing, its engine idling with a low hum. It was Richard. He had not just sent the law, he had come to watch the execution. A man and a woman in uniform stepped onto my porch. Behind them was a woman in a gray suit holding a clipboard, her face set in a mask of bureaucratic indifference. This was the social worker, the executioner with a pen. The male officer stepped forward, his hand resting casually but intentionally near his belt. He asked if I was Warren Fitzgerald. I told him I was. He did not ask if he could come in. He stepped past me into my living room, his boots leaving mud on the rug my late wife had crocheted. Leo stood up, he dropped the glass. It shattered on the floor, a sharp explosion that made everyone flinch except the social worker. She looked at the broken glass, looked at the water spreading on the floor, looked at the piles of trash bags, and then made a check mark on her clipboard. That check mark was a nail in my son's coffin. The officer asked Leo to identify himself. Leo stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He said, "I am Leo. This is my son, Toby. We are just visiting my father." The officer shook his head. He pulled a folded paper from his vest. He said, "Mr. Vance, we have an emergency court order signed by Judge Holloway an hour ago. You are in violation of a custody agreement and you are being investigated for parental kidnapping. We are here to remove the minor child, Toby Vance, from this environment immediately." Leo let out a sound that I will never forget. It was a high, thin keen, like a wire being pulled until it snaps. He stepped in front of Toby, shielding the boy with his body. He said, "Kidnapping. I am his father. I have never hurt him. We just left the house today. I have rights." The social worker stepped forward. She spoke in a voice that was calm and utterly devoid of humanity. She said, "Mr. Vance, the court has received evidence that you are currently homeless, unemployed, and displaying erratic behavior. We have a sworn affidavit from Mr. Harrington stating that you forcibly removed the child from his school and brought him to an unsafe location." Looking around, she paused, letting her eyes drift to the water stain on my ceiling and the peeling wallpaper. She said, "I can see the affidavit was accurate. This environment is not suitable for a child. There is broken glass on the floor. There is no furniture. This is neglect." I felt the rage rising in my chest, a hot tide of lava. I stepped forward. I said, "This is my home. It is clean. It is safe. And that broken glass is there because you barged in like stormtroopers." The second officer stepped in front of me, blocking my path to his partner. He was young, arrogant, and he looked at me like I was something he had scraped off his shoe. He said, "Sir, step back. Do not interfere with a court order or you will be arrested for obstruction." Leo was pleading now. He was begging. He grabbed the social worker's sleeve. He said, "Please listen to me. My father-in-law fired me today. He kicked us out. He is doing this to hurt me. Toby is fine. Look at him. He is fine." Toby was not fine. He was huddled on the lumpy couch, clutching the muddy teddy bear we had rescued from the trash. He was crying silent, shaking sobs, his eyes darting between his father and the strangers with guns. The social worker pulled her arm away from Leo's grip as if he were contagious. She said, "Mr. Vance, do not touch me. We are taking the child. You can attend the hearing on Monday to plead your case. Until then, custody is remanded to his grandfather, Mr. Richard Harrington." She walked toward the couch. Leo lunged. He was not a fighter. He was a man who worked with spreadsheets and operations logistics. But in that moment, he was a father. He tried to get between her and his son. The reaction was instant and violent. The two officers grabbed Leo. They slammed him against the wall. The drywall cracked under the impact. They twisted his arms behind his back. Leo screamed in pain and frustration. He shouted, "Toby, Daddy is here. Daddy loves you. Don't be scared." Toby screamed. He reached out his small arms. He shouted, "Daddy, Daddy, help me." The social worker picked Toby up. She did not hold him like a child. She held him like a package. She carried him toward the door. Toby was kicking and screaming, calling for his father, calling for me. I saw his little hands reaching out, grasping at the air. I stood there, my fists clenched at my sides. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to fight. I wanted to tear these men apart. I wanted to break them. I knew how to hurt people. I had grown up in neighborhoods where you fought for your shoes. But I knew that if I threw a punch now, I would go to jail and Leo would truly be alone. Richard wanted me to fight. He wanted me arrested. He wanted the mugshot to prove that Leo came from violent stock. So I stood still. I stood still, and I watched them take my grandson. I watched them drag him out into the cold night. I watched the social worker buckle him into the back of the town car where Richard sat in the shadows. The officers released Leo. They shoved him away from the wall. One of them pointed a finger in his face. He said, "You are lucky we aren't taking you in for resisting. Stay away from the Harrington property. Stay away from the boy until the court says otherwise. If you come within 500 feet, we will arrest you." They turned and walked out. The door did not slam. It was left hanging open, letting the night chill fill the room. We heard the car doors close. We heard the engines rev. We heard the tires crunch on the gravel as they drove away, taking the only thing in the world that mattered. Leo stood in the center of the room. He was gasping for air, hyperventilating. He looked at his hands. He looked at the open door. Then his legs gave out. He collapsed onto the floor, right into the puddle of water and broken glass. He did not seem to feel the shards cutting into his skin. He curled into a ball and let out a howl of pure agony. It was the sound of a man who has lost his soul. He sobbed into the dirty rug. He muttered over and over, "I am sorry. I am sorry, Toby. I failed you. I am nothing." I closed the front door. I locked it. I walked over to the window and watched the taillights disappear down the dark street. I saw Richard's car turn the corner, heading back to his mansion, back to his victory lap. He thought he had won. He thought he had crushed us. I turned back to my son. Leo was still on the floor, weeping. He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears and snot, his eyes wild and desperate. He crawled toward me on his hands and knees. He said, "Dad, I have to go to him. I have to go to Richard." I looked at him. I asked, "What are you talking about?" Leo tried to stand up, slipping on the wet floor. He said, "I have to go back. I have to beg him. I will sign the papers. I will sign the false financial reports. I will admit to the fraud. I will do whatever he wants. I will be his slave if he just lets me see Toby. I don't care about my dignity. I don't care about the truth. I just want my son back. Please, Dad, drive me there. I have to beg him." He grabbed my shirt, pulling at the flannel fabric. He was hysterical. He was willing to destroy his future, willing to go to prison for a crime he didn't commit just to stop the pain. He was willing to let Richard win completely. I looked at my son. I saw the fear. I saw the weakness that years of living in Richard's shadow had bred into him. And I knew that words would not reach him now. He was in a panic spiral. He needed a shock. He needed to be reset. I grabbed his wrists and pulled his hands off my shirt. I held him steady. I looked him in the eye. And then I slapped him. It was a hard slap. The sound of it cracked through the small room like a gunshot. Leo's head snapped to the side. He stumbled back, holding his cheek. The shock silenced his sobbing. He looked at me, his eyes wide with confusion and betrayal. I did not apologize. I stepped into his space, forcing him to look at me. My voice was low and hard, like the grinding of gears in heavy machinery. I said, "Do not ever let me hear you say that again. You do not beg, you do not crawl, you are a Fitzgerald. We do not negotiate with terrorists and we do not bow to tyrants." Leo stared at me, trembling. He whispered, "But Dad, he has Toby. He has everything." I grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him. I said, "He has nothing. He has a boy who is crying for his father. He has a stolen victory, and he has a mountain of debt that he thinks is a secret. You want to beg him. You want to give him your life. For what? So he can spit on you again. So he can teach your son that his father is a coward who signs lies to save his own skin." I let him go. I walked to the kitchen counter. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the hunt. I had spent 40 years building a fortress around my life, building a wall of silence to keep this exact kind of poison out. But they had breached the wall. They had come into my house and taken my blood. I reached into the pocket of my work pants. I pulled out the old Nokia phone. It was heavy, a brick of plastic and metal that belonged to a different era. An era when I was known as the wolf of the industrial sector. An era when men trembled when I walked into a boardroom. I flipped it open. The screen glowed green in the dim light. I dialed the number. 1. Speed dial. It rang once, so Catherine answered. Her voice was crisp, efficient. She said, "Mr. Fitzgerald?" I said, "Catherine. The timeline has moved up. We are not waiting for the board meeting. I want you to initiate the hostility protocols immediately." There was a pause. I could hear the clicking of a keyboard in the background. Catherine asked, "What is the target, sir?" I looked at Leo. He was standing by the wall, holding his cheek, watching me. He looked scared of me. Good. Fear is better than despair. Fear makes you alert. I said into the phone, "The target is Richard Harrington, personally and professionally. I want you to call the bank that holds the note on his estate. Buy the mortgage. Call his suppliers. Buy the debt. I want you to freeze his credit lines. I want every check he writes tomorrow morning to bounce." Catherine said, "Sir, that will require liquidating the emergency reserves. It is a significant capital expenditure." I looked at the broken glass on the floor. I looked at the empty space on the couch where my grandson had been sitting. I said, "Burn it. Burn it all if you have to. I want him insolvent by sunrise. And Catherine, get the legal team, the sharks, not the corporate lawyers. I want the ones we use for war. I want a custody suit filed in federal court, alleging kidnapping, emotional distress, and endangerment. And I want it on the news." Leo was staring at me. His mouth was open. He had never heard me speak like this. He had only ever heard me talk about the weather or the price of gas. He was seeing a stranger in his father's skin. I continued, my voice dropping to a growl. "And Catherine, send the car. The Phantom. Not to the office. Send it to my house. The address in the suburbs." Catherine said, "Understood, sir. ETA 20 minutes. I hung up the phone. I snapped it shut. I placed it on the counter. I turned to Leo. He whispered, "Dad, who are you? What is going on? What is Titan Holdings?" I walked over to the closet near the front door. It was locked with a heavy padlock. I took a key from around my neck. I opened it. Inside, hanging in a plastic bag, was a suit. It was a charcoal gray bespoke Italian wool suit. It was 20 years old, but it was timeless. Beside it was a pair of black Oxfords polished to a mirror shine. I took the suit out. I laid it on the couch. I began to unbutton my flannel shirt. I said to Leo, "You asked me who I am. I am the man who built the foundation that Richard Harrington stands on. I am the man who owns the concrete his mansion is built on. I am the man who decided 40 years ago that money was a disease, and I quarantined myself to save you. I took off my work boots. I put on the dress shoes. I stood up straighter. The arthritis seemed to vanish. The slump of the retired worker disappeared. I said, "But the disease found us anyway, Leo. It found us because you married it, and now I have to cut it out." I pointed to the bathroom. I said, "Go wash your face, put on your suit, fix your tie. You look like a victim. I need you to look like a successor." Leo didn't move. He asked, "Successor to what?" I buttoned the vest of my suit. I adjusted the cuffs. I looked at my son, and for the first time I let him see the predator that lived behind my eyes. I said, "Successor to the throne. We are going to the tower, Leo. And when we walk in, Richard Harrington is going to realize that he didn't kick a dog. He kicked a lion. Now get dressed. Project Titan has begun." The ride into the city was unlike any journey my son had ever taken with me. We sat in the back of the Phantom, the black leather seats smelling of success and silence. I watched Leo out of the corner of my eye. He was sitting on the edge of the seat, his hands resting nervously on his knees, afraid to lean back, afraid to get comfortable. He looked at the partition separating us from the driver, then at the tinted windows that turned the passing city into a noir film. He was trying to rationalize what was happening. His mind, trained in the logic of mid-level management, was frantically searching for an explanation that fit his worldview. He finally spoke when we crossed the bridge, the skyline of the financial district looming ahead of us like a fortress of steel and glass. He asked me if this was a company car. He asked if I knew someone, a former boss maybe, who was lending us a favor. He whispered that we could not afford this, that hiring a car like this for an hour cost more than my monthly pension. I did not answer him. I simply adjusted my cufflinks and watched the city approach. I was not looking at the buildings as scenery. I was looking at them as inventory. We pulled up to the curb in front of the Titan Tower. It is the tallest building in the city, a needle of black glass piercing the clouds. It is a monument to industry, a monolith that houses the nerve center of the Eastern Seaboard's logistics network. Tourists stop on the sidewalk to take pictures of it. Businessmen walk through its revolving doors, hoping to survive the day. The driver opened the door. I stepped out onto the pavement. The wind whipped my tie, but I stood firm. Leo scrambled out after me, looking up at the building with a mixture of awe and dread. He grabbed my arm. He pulled me toward the side of the entrance, away from the main doors. He hissed that we shouldn't be here. He said that security in these places is tight. He said if I was looking for work, we should go to the service entrance around the back. He thought I was there to apply for a job as a night watchman. He thought I was desperate enough to beg for a minimum wage position to pay for a lawyer. I looked at my son. The wind was messing up his hair. He looked so small against the backdrop of the tower. I gently removed his hand from my arm. I told him we do not use the service entrance. I told him we walk through the front door. I walked toward the main entrance. The glass doors were 12 feet high. A team of security guards in dark suits stood inside, monitoring the flow of people. Leo was following me, but he was lagging behind, preparing himself for the embarrassment of being turned away. He was preparing an apology. He was ready to tell the guards that his father was confused, that we were leaving immediately. I pushed through the revolving door. The lobby was a cavern of marble and echoing footsteps. The air was cool and smelled of white lilies. As I entered, the head of security, a man named Miller, who had been with me since the 90s, looked up from his console. He saw me. His eyes widened. He tapped his earpiece. He stepped out from behind the desk. Leo froze. He thought Miller was coming to throw us out. He started to stammer an excuse, but Miller walked right past Leo. He stopped in front of me. He stood at attention. He said, "Good morning, Mr. Fitzgerald. It has been a long time. The elevators are waiting." I nodded at Miller. I said, "Good morning, Miller. Keep the lobby clear. I have a guest." I kept walking. Leo stood there, his mouth open, staring at Miller, then at my back. He had to jog to catch up with me. He asked me in a frantic whisper how I knew him. He asked why he called me Mr. Fitzgerald. I did not answer. I walked past the bank of elevators that served the general public. I walked past the elevators that served the executive floors. I walked to the far wall, to a single unmarked set of steel doors that had no call button. I placed my hand on a small black panel on the wall. A red laser scanned my palm. There was a soft chime and the steel doors slid open soundlessly. The interior was paneled in mahogany. There were no buttons inside, only a single key slot. I ushered Leo inside. He stepped in tentatively, looking at the wood paneling as if it were a trap. I followed him, and the doors slid shut, sealing us in. I took a silver key from my pocket and inserted it into the slot. I turned it. The elevator began to move. It did not jerk or shudder. It simply began a smooth, rapid ascent that pressed us gently into the floor. Leo looked at the digital display above the door. It was counting the floors. 10, 20, 30. He looked at me. He was sweating. He asked where we were going. He asked what was happening. He said, "Dad, please, you are scaring me." Who are these people? I watched the numbers climb. 50, 60, 70. I said nothing. I let the silence do the work. I let the reality of the situation seep into his bones. We were rising above the city, rising above the noise, rising above the level where Richard Harrington lived his life. The elevator slowed and came to a stop. The display read 80, the penthouse. The doors opened. We stepped out into a vast open space. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a 360-degree view of the city and the harbor beyond. The floor was polished concrete. In the center of the room was a massive desk made of reclaimed timber from a shipyard I had bought in 1985. Standing by the desk was a woman. She was in her late 40s, wearing a suit that was sharp enough to cut glass. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun. She was holding a tablet. This was Catherine, my right hand, my gatekeeper, the woman who knew where every skeleton was buried because she had helped dig the graves. She looked up as we entered. She did not smile. She simply nodded. She said, "Welcome back, Mr. Chairman. The board is on standby for the emergency call. The legal team is assembled in the conference room." Leo stopped dead. He looked at Catherine. He looked at the desk. He looked at the view. And then he looked at me. The pieces were slamming together in his mind, but they didn't fit the picture he had carried for 35 years. He whispered, "Chairman." "Dad. She called you Chairman." I walked over to the desk. I ran my hand along the rough wood. It felt like coming home. I turned to face my son. I stood with the city behind me, the sun creating a halo around my silhouette. I said, "Leo, welcome to Titan Holdings. This is my company. I built it from a single truck and a loan shark's money. I built it while you were sleeping in your crib. I own the industrial parks. I own the shipping containers in the harbor. I own the concrete under your feet." Leo shook his head, a gesture of denial. He said, "No, that's impossible. You worked maintenance. You fixed boilers. We lived on coupons. Why? Why would you live like that if you had this? I walked around the desk and sat in the leather chair. It groaned familiarly under my weight. I looked at him with a mixture of love and hardness. I said, "Because wealth is a poison, Leo. I saw what it did to my competitors. I saw their children turn into vultures waiting for them to die useless and entitled. I wanted you to build your own ladder, not inherit an elevator. I wanted you to know the value of $1 because you sweat for it, not because you inherited it." Leo looked around the room, his eyes wide, trying to reconcile the father who fixed his bike with duct tape to the man sitting in the seat of a Titan. He asked, so it was all a lie. My whole life was a lie. I leaned forward. I said no. The love was real. The lessons were real. The struggle was real because I chose it. But I made a mistake. I thought that by keeping you away from the money, I was protecting you. Instead, I left you vulnerable to people like Richard Harrington, people who use money as a weapon. I sent a sheep out into a world of wolves because I didn't want you to have claws. That is my fault. And now I have to fix it. Leo walked over to the window. He looked down at the city 80 stories below. The cars looked like ants. The people were invisible. He was seeing the world from a god's perspective for the first time. He asked quietly, "So what happens now?" I looked at Catherine. I nodded. She stepped forward. She was holding a thick black folder. She placed it on the desk in front of me. It made a heavy thud. I said, "Come here, Leo. Sit down." Leo walked to the chair opposite the desk. He sat down. He looked at the folder. It had no label, just a black surface that absorbed the light. I said, "Inside this folder is the truth about your father-in-law. You think he is a giant. You think he is a king. You think he kicked you out because he is powerful." I opened the folder. I spun it around so it faced Leo. The first page was a summary sheet highlighted in red. The numbers were staggering. I said, "Richard Harrington is not a king. He is a tenant. And he is a very bad tenant." Leo looked at the page. His eyes scanned the lines. He frowned. He read out loud liabilities $50 million. Primary creditor Titan Holdings. He looked up at me, his face pale. He said, "Titan Holdings. You. He owes you $50 million. I nodded. I said, "Richard Harrington built his empire on land that I own. He built his warehouses with loans that I underwrote through shell companies. He leveraged his house, his cars, his inventory, everything, to expand into markets he didn't understand. He has not made a principal payment in 8 months. He has been cooking the books to hide the fact that he is insolvent. That is why he wanted you to sign those papers, Leo. He needed a fall guy. He needed someone to go to prison when the house of cards collapsed." Leo stared at the paper. His hands began to shake. He was realizing that the man who had called him unworthy, the man who had thrown his son's toys in the mud, was living on borrowed time and borrowed money. He was realizing that the power Richard wielded was an illusion. I continued, my voice steady and cold. I said, "He is 2 days away from default. The covenants on his loans allow me to call the debt at any time if there is a breach of contract. Firing you without cause, attempting to defraud the shareholders, kidnapping my grandson, those are all breaches." I reached into the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a notice of foreclosure and seizure of assets. It was already drafted. It just needed a signature. I slid it across the desk to Leo. I also slid a heavy fountain pen across the wood. I said, "I can sign this, Leo. I can end him right now. I can make a phone call and security will escort him out of his own building before lunch. I can take his house. I can take his cars. I can leave him on the street with nothing, just like he did to you." Leo looked at the pen. He looked at the document. He picked up the pen. It was heavy in his hand. He looked at the name at the bottom of the page. Richard Harrington. The man who had terrorized him for 7 years, I said, but I am not going to sign it. You are. You are the chief operating officer, or you were. You know the operations. You know the fraud. If you sign this, you are initiating the hostile takeover of Harrington Luxury. You will be the one to pull the trigger. Leo held the pen. His hand was trembling. He looked at me. He asked why. Why are you letting me do this? I said because he didn't just steal my money. He stole your son. He stole your manhood. You need to take it back. You need to be the one to show him that the bloodline he spit on is the bloodline that owns him. Leo looked down at the paper again. He thought about the mud on the teddy bear. He thought about Toby crying in the back of the police car. He thought about Rachel closing the curtains. The trembling in his hand stopped. His grip on the pen tightened. The fear in his eyes was replaced by something else. A cold, hard resolve. It was the look of a man who has decided to stop being a victim. He looked up at me. He didn't smile. He just nodded. He said, "Let's take it all." I leaned back in my chair. I watched my son. I watched him read the document, understanding the power he now held. I said, "Catherine, tell the legal team to prepare the filings and get me the details on tonight's charity gala." Leo looked up. He asked Gala. I smiled. I said yes. Richard is throwing a party tonight. He thinks he is going to charm investors into saving him. He has invited the press. He wants to show the world how successful he is. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city that I had conquered 40 years ago. I said, "We are going to go to that party, Leo. But we aren't going as guests, and we aren't going as billionaires. Not yet." Leo asked, "Then how are we going?" I turned back to him. I said, "We are going to give Richard exactly what he expects. He thinks we are garbage. He thinks we are servants. So we are going to serve him. We are going to walk into that party through the service entrance. We are going to wear the uniforms. We are going to let him humiliate us one last time in front of all his friends and cameras." Leo looked confused. He asked, "Why, Dad? Why would we do that if we have this?" He tapped the folder. I said, "Because when you destroy a man like Richard, you don't just take his money. You take his reputation. You let him show the world exactly who he is. You let him spit on you while the cameras are rolling. And then when he feels like a god, you introduce him to the devil." I walked over to Leo. I put my hand on his shoulder. I said, "Tonight we are going to clean up the trash. Tonight Richard Harrington finds out that he has been living in my house all along." Leo stood up. He held the file to his chest like a shield. He looked at Catherine. He looked at me. He said, "Okay, Dad. Let's go to work." The elevator doors opened. We stepped back inside. But we were different men than the ones who had come up. We were no longer father and son from the suburbs. We were Titan Holdings. And we were descending to bring judgment. We stayed in the penthouse as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the city skyline in hues of bruised purple and gold. The air in the office was thick with the static electricity of a coming storm. Leo was still sitting in the leather chair opposite my desk, his hand resting on the black folder that contained the financial obituary of Richard Harrington. He looked different than he had an hour ago. The slump in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a rigid tension. He wasn't broken anymore. He was vibrating with the kinetic energy of a man who has been handed a loaded gun and pointed toward his tormentor. Catherine moved silently around the room, arranging documents on the reclaimed timber desk. She placed a tablet in front of me, the screen glowing with the details of the evening's event. She said, "Mr. Chairman, the logistics for the gala are confirmed. It is the annual Heritage Foundation Ball. Richard Harrington is the chairman of the hosting committee. He has invited every major investor in the tri-state area. The press list includes all the major financial journals. He is planning to announce a new strategic partnership to save his company. I looked at the guest list. It was a roll call of the city's elite. Men and women I had done business with for decades. Men and women who knew the name Titan Holdings, but did not know the face of Warren Fitzgerald. Richard was betting everything on this night. He was going to stand on a stage surrounded by flowers and champagne and lie to the world. He was going to project success while his foundation rotted. Leo stood up and walked to the window looking down at the streets 80 stories below. He said so, we just walk in. We walk in there with the foreclosure notice and shut it down. We embarrass him in front of everyone. I swiveled my chair to face him. I steepled my fingers. I said we could do that. We could walk in the front door flanked by lawyers and security. We could serve him the papers before the appetizers are served. It would be efficient. It would be brutal. Leo turned to look at me. He asked, "Isn't that what we want?" Brutal efficiency. I shook my head slowly. I said, "Efficiency is for business, Leo. This is not just business. This is an exorcism. If we walk in as Titan Holdings, Richard will spin it. He will say he is a victim of a hostile takeover. He will play the martyr. He will tell Rachel that evil corporate raiders destroyed her legacy. And she might believe him. She might hate you for it." Leo flinched at her name. He asked, "What do you mean?" I stood up and walked over to him. I put a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tension in his frame. I said, "You need to know, Leo. You need to know if your wife is a victim of her father's bullying or an accomplice to his cruelty. You need to see her when she thinks you are nothing. You need to see her when she thinks she has won." Leo looked confused. He asked, "How am I supposed to do that?" "She won't talk to me." She closed the curtains. I smiled a thin, tight smile. I said, "People do not look at the help, Leo. To people like Richard and Rachel, waiters and bartenders are furniture. They are invisible. They say things in front of servants that they would never say in mixed company. They show their true faces because they don't think the people serving them are human enough to judge them." I walked back to the desk and picked up the tablet. I tapped the screen, bringing up the catering contract for the gala. I said, "I own the catering company, Leo. I bought it 6 months ago as part of a portfolio acquisition. I have already made the call. 2 staff members have called in sick for tonight's shift. We are the replacements." Leo stared at me, his eyes widening. He whispered, "You want me to be a waiter. You want me to serve champagne to the man who kicked me out of my house. You want me to serve hors d'oeuvres to my wife while she pretends I don't exist." I nodded. I said, "Yes. I want you to put on the uniform. I want you to carry the tray. I want you to walk through that crowd and listen. I want you to hear what they say about you when they think you are gone. I want you to see Richard when he is drunk on his own ego. And I want you to stand in front of Rachel and offer her a drink. I want you to look her in the eye, while you are on your knees, essentially, and see if she lifts you up or if she looks through you." Leo paced the room, his hands running through his hair. He said, "Dad, that is humiliation. That is torture. Why would I do that? I have the power now. I have the papers. Why do I have to debase myself again?" I leaned against the heavy wooden desk, crossing my arms. I said, "Because you need to be sure, Leo. You still love her, don't you? A part of you still hopes she will leave him and come back to you." Leo stopped pacing. He looked down at the floor. He didn't answer, but his silence was a scream. I continued, my voice soft but unrelenting. I said, "If we destroy Richard tonight without giving her a chance to choose, you will always wonder. You will always wonder if she stayed with him out of fear or out of greed. But if you stand in front of her stripped of everything, offering her nothing but yourself, and she still rejects you, then you will know. You will be free. The foreclosure will handle Richard. The uniform will handle Rachel. Leo looked up. There were tears in his eyes again, but they weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of a man saying goodbye to a ghost. He took a deep breath. Mom. He squared his shoulders. He asked, "Do we have the uniforms?" I looked at Catherine. She nodded and walked to a side door. She opened it and pulled out a garment rack. On it hung 2 black vests, 2 white shirts, and 2 black bow ties. They were the uniform of the invisible class, the uniform of the people who clean up the messes of the rich. I walked over to the rack. I ran my hand over the fabric of one of the vests. It was cheap polyester rough to the touch. It was a stark contrast to the Italian wool I was currently wearing. I said to Leo, "I will be right there with you, son. I am not sending you into the trenches alone. I will be bussing tables. I will be filling water glasses. I will be the old man they snap their fingers at." Leo looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He asked, "You would do that? You are the chairman. You are worth billions." I took the hanger with the larger vest. I began to unbutton my expensive jacket. I said, "Titles are just costumes, Leo. Beneath this suit, I am still the man who fixed boilers. I am still the man who isn't afraid to get his hands dirty. And tonight, we are going to get very dirty." We changed in the office. It was a silent ritual. We stripped off the symbols of power and put on the symbols of servitude. The white shirts were stiff with starch. The vests were tight. The bow ties were clip-ons, cheap and efficient. When we were dressed, I looked at Leo. He looked different. The suit had made him look like an executive, but the waiter's uniform made him look like something else. It made him look dangerous. Because a man in a waiter's uniform with the eyes of a wolf is a terrifying thing. He looked like an assassin in disguise. Catherine stood by the door holding the black folder. She said, "The car is waiting downstairs to take you to the service entrance. The legal team is on standby in the van down the street. When you give the signal, we move." I asked, "What is the signal?" Catherine smiled a rare expression that made her look fierce. She said, "When the glass breaks, sir." I nodded. I turned to Leo. I adjusted his bow tie, pulling it straight. I looked him in the eyes. I saw the fear, but I also saw the resolve. He was ready to walk through the fire one last time. I said, "Remember, Leo, tonight you are a ghost. You do not speak unless spoken to. You do not react. You observe. You gather intelligence. And when the moment comes, you strike." Leo nodded. He said, "I am ready, Dad. Let's go see what my wife is really made of." We took the service elevator down. It smelled of cleaning supplies and trash. It was fitting. We were descending from Olympus to the underworld. We walked out the back door of the tower into the alley where a nondescript delivery van was waiting. The ride to the gala venue was short. The event was being held at the Grand View Hotel, a historic ballroom in the center of the city. We entered through the kitchen. The air was hot and smelled of roasted meat and stress. Chefs were shouting, the waiters were rushing back and forth with trays of silver. It was a chaotic ballet of service. The catering manager, a man named Stefano, who had no idea I signed his paychecks, spotted us. He barked, "You two are late. Grab a tray. Champagne is circulating. Keep the glasses full. If I see an empty hand, I will dock your pay." "Move." He shoved a tray of crystal flutes into Leo's hands. Leo almost dropped it, but he recovered. He looked at me. I nodded. I grabbed a pitcher of water and a stack of napkins. We pushed through the swinging doors and entered the ballroom. The noise hit us first. A wall of chatter and laughter and clinking glass. The room was bathed in golden light from massive chandeliers. There were hundreds of people. The women were dripping in diamonds, the men were puffing out their chests in tuxedos. It was a sea of wealth and arrogance. And there, in the center of it all, holding court near the ice sculpture, was Richard Harrington. He looked flushed, triumphant. He was laughing at something a banker was saying. his head thrown back, his hand resting possessively on the shoulder of a senator. He looked like a man who had gotten away with murder. And standing next to him, looking like a porcelain doll in a blue silk gown, was Rachel. She was smiling, but her eyes were darting around the room, nervous, tight. She was playing the part of the dutiful daughter, the hostess of the evening. She was protecting the lie. I moved to the perimeter of the room, filling water glasses at the empty tables. I watched Leo. He moved into the crowd. He walked with a steady gait, balancing the tray of champagne. He weaved through the guests invisible to them. He passed men who had likely denied him loans. He passed women who had snubbed him at the country club. None of them looked at his face. They only saw the tray. They reached out, took a glass, and turned their backs on him. I saw him approaching Richard's circle. My heart rate climbed. This was the test. Richard was telling a story. He was loud. He said, yes, it was unfortunate about my son-in-law. Poor Leo. He just cracked under the pressure. Some men aren't built for the big leagues. I had to let him go for his own good, really. We tried to help him, but he was stealing from the company. Can you imagine? Biting the hand that feeds you. The group gasped, scandalized. A woman asked, and what about Rachel? How is she handling it? Richard sighed a dramatic fake sound. He said, she is devastated, of course. But she is strong. She knows she deserves better. We are already talking to lawyers. An annulment seems best. Erase the mistake entirely. Leo was standing right behind him, holding the tray. He heard every word. I saw his back stiffen. I saw his knuckles turn white on the silver platter. He was 5 feet away from the man who was rewriting his history, destroying his character while drinking his wine. Then Rachel spoke. Her voice was soft, but it carried. She said, Daddy is right. Leo was. He was a mistake. I was young. I didn't realize how weak he was until today. When he came to the house begging, it was pathetic. I just want to move on. I just want to forget he ever existed. I saw Leo freeze. That was the dagger. Not the father's lies, but the wife's betrayal. She wasn't scared. She wasn't coerced. She was rewriting history too. She was saving her own skin by throwing him to the wolves. Leo took a breath. I saw his shoulders drop. The tension left him. It was replaced by a cold clarity. He stepped forward. He thrust the tray into the center of the circle. He said, Champagne, ma'am. Rachel turned. She looked at the tray. She reached for a glass. Her hand brushed Leo's fingers. She looked up. Her eyes met his. For a second, time stopped. The color drained from her face. Her mouth opened in a silent gasp. She dropped the glass. It hit the floor and shattered a sharp bell-like sound that cut through the chatter. Richard spun around. He saw Leo. His eyes bugged out. He sputtered, You! What are you doing here? Security! Leo did not back down. He did not look at Richard. He kept his eyes on Rachel. He looked at her with a profound pity. He said, I just wanted to make sure your glass was full, Rachel. I know how much you like to drink when you are lying. The circle of guests went silent. People turned to stare. The murmur of the party died down, replaced by the electric tension of a scene unfolding. Richard stepped forward, his face purple. He hissed, Get out! Get out before I kill you, you trash, you waiter. Leo smiled. He set the tray down on a nearby table with a deliberate clatter. He took off his bow tie. He unbuttoned his vest. He said, I am not a waiter, Richard, and I am not trash. I am the man who knows where the money went. I stepped out from the shadows then. I walked across the dance floor, my old shoes clicking on the parquet. I was still holding the water pitcher. I walked until I was standing next to my son. Richard looked at me. He laughed a nervous, high-pitched sound. He said, And look who else is here. The janitor. Did you come to mop up the spill? I set the pitcher down. I took a rag from my pocket and wiped my hands. I looked at the crowd. I saw the bankers. I saw the investors. I saw the people Richard desperately needed to impress. I looked at Richard. I said, "No, Richard. I didn't come to mop up. I came to collect." Richard looked confused. He said, "Collect what?" "You have nothing." I reached into the inside pocket of my cheap polyester vest. I pulled out the black folder, the one Catherine had prepared. I held it up. I said I came to collect on the $50 million you owe Titan Holdings. Richard froze. He whispered, "Titan Holdings. What do you know about Titan Holdings?" I opened the folder. I took out the notice of foreclosure. I said, "I know everything about them, Richard, because I am Titan Holdings." I threw the papers at his feet. They scattered across the floor, mixing with the broken glass and the spilled champagne. I looked at my son. I nodded. I said, "Leo, tell them. Tell them who the real boss is." Leo stepped forward. He looked at his wife, who was trembling. He looked at his father-in-law, who was shrinking. He said, "My father isn't a janitor, Richard. He is the chairman. And as of 5 minutes ago, he owns this building. He owns your house. He owns your company." Leo paused, letting the words sink in. He said, "And I am the new CEO. And you are trespassing." I took off my vest. I dropped it on the floor next to the papers. I revealed the label on the inside of my shirt. It was custom made. I said, "Tonight we are taking out the trash, and Richard, you are the first bag." The room erupted. The cameras flashed. And in the center of the chaos, my son stood tall. He was no longer a victim. He was a titan. The ballroom smelled of roasted duck and desperation disguised as expensive perfume. From my position near the service entrance, holding a pitcher of ice water wrapped in a linen napkin, I watched the ecosystem of the elite. It was a shark tank where everyone smiled and showed their teeth, not to be friendly, but to check for blood in the water. And Richard Harrington was bleeding. I could see it in the way he gripped his whiskey glass, his knuckles white against the crystal. I could see it in the sheen of sweat on his upper lip that the ballroom's air conditioning couldn't dry. He was working the room with a frantic energy, laughing too loud at jokes that weren't funny, clapping men on the back with too much force. He was a man trying to hold up a collapsing ceiling with one hand while shaking hands with the other. My son Leo moved through the crowd like a ghost in a black vest. He was carrying a heavy silver tray loaded with crab cakes and caviar blinis. I watched him approach a group of investors Richard was currently courting. Leo's face was a mask of neutral servitude. He had buried his pride deep in his gut, exactly as I had asked him to. He was gathering intelligence, listening to the whispers, but more importantly, he was acting as the bait for the trap we were about to spring. Richard was in the middle of a boast, telling a group of bankers about his upcoming expansion into the European market. A lie so bold it almost made me laugh out loud, considering he couldn't even pay the electric bill for his warehouses. He turned, looking for a waiter to refresh his drink, and his eyes landed on Leo. For a second, Richard froze. His brain couldn't process the image. In his mind, he had discarded Leo hours ago. He had thrown him into the street, erased him from the narrative. Seeing him here inside the sanctuary of his wealth, wearing the uniform of the help, caused a short circuit in Richard's arrogance. Then the shock replaced itself with a cruel, predatory delight. A slow smile spread across Richard's face. It was the smile of a bully who realizes his victim has crawled back into the schoolyard for more punishment. Richard raised his hand, not to signal for a drink, but to stop the conversation. He tapped his spoon against his glass. The sharp, high-pitched ringing cut through the murmur of the crowd. Silence rippled outward from his circle until the entire ballroom was quiet, hundreds of eyes turning toward the host. Richard stepped up to the small podium where the jazz band had been playing. He grabbed the microphone. His eyes were locked on Leo, who stood frozen in the middle of the floor, the silver tray heavy in his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard boomed, his voice amplified and distorted by the speakers. "I hope you are enjoying the hospitality of Harrington Luxury tonight. We pride ourselves on excellence, on resilience, and on charity. And speaking of charity, I want to draw your attention to a very special member of our service staff tonight." He pointed a finger directly at Leo. A spotlight controlled by a technician who thought this was part of the show swung around and hit my son. Leo blinked in the harsh white light, looking isolated and exposed. "That man right there," as Richard continued, his voice dripping with mock sympathy, "used to be a member of my family. He was my chief operating officer just this morning. But as we all know, business is a meritocracy, and some bloodlines simply aren't built for the pressure of the top tier." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter and whispers moved through the room. I saw guests leaning in their eyes wide with the thrill of public scandal. They weren't horrified. They were entertained. This was blood sport to them. Richard walked off the stage, the microphone still in his hand, the cord trailing behind him like a snake. He walked toward Leo. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, giving him a wide berth. "I had to let him go," Richard said, circling Leo like a vulture. "For cause, of course. Financial irregularities. Incompetence. It broke my heart, truly. But I am a benevolent man. When I saw him begging for work in the kitchen tonight, I couldn't say no. I firmly believe in giving people work that suits their station in life. And I think we can all agree he looks much more natural holding a tray than he ever did holding a pen." Leo did not move. He did not speak. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set so tight I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. He was remembering the muddy teddy bear. He was remembering his son crying in the police car. He was using that pain as armor. Richard stopped in front of Leo. He reached out and plucked a crab cake from the tray. He ate it slowly, chewing with his mouth open, crumbs falling onto Leo's pristine white shirt. "Excellent service," Leo, Richard said, spraying bits of food. "But you missed a spot." Richard looked around the room, his eyes landing on a heavy-set man in a tuxedo standing nearby. It was Senator Sterling, a man whose zoning committee votes Richard desperately needed to buy. The senator was holding a glass of red wine, looking amused by the spectacle. Senator Richard called out, "I apologize for the interruption, but I noticed earlier that your shoes looked a bit dusty. The construction on the new wing, I assume." The senator looked down at his patent leather shoes. They were spotless, but he understood the game. He smiled a greasy politician's smile. "Well, Richard, the streets are a bit dirty these days." Richard turned back to Leo. He snapped his fingers. "You heard the senator, boy. His shoes are dusty. And since you are here to serve, why don't you make yourself useful? Put down the tray." Leo stood still. The room held its breath. This was the line. This was the moment where dignity usually snaps. Richard's voice dropped an octave, losing the jovial tone, becoming pure menace. I said, "Put down the tray, Leo, unless you want me to call the police right now and tell them you are trespassing. I am sure that would violate your restraining order regarding your son. You wouldn't want to spend the night in a cell while Toby wonders where his daddy is, would you?" The threat was a physical blow. Mentioning Toby was the key. Richard knew exactly where to twist the knife. Slowly, agonizingly, Leo lowered the silver tray to a nearby table. The glasses clinked softly. Richard pointed at the floor. "Down," he commanded, like a dog. I gripped the handle of the water pitcher so hard I felt the plastic begin to crack. I took a step forward. I was ready to end this. I was ready to tear Richard's throat out right there on the parquet floor. But then Leo looked at me. He looked across the room through the blinding spotlight and found my eyes in the shadows. He gave me a microscopic shake of his head. Do not interfere. Not yet. He was sticking to the plan. He was going to let Richard hang himself with his own rope. Leo slowly lowered himself to one knee, then the other. He was kneeling on the floor in his waiter's uniform, surrounded by the people who used to be his peers. He pulled a white linen napkin from his pocket. Richard beamed. He looked at the crowd, arms spread wide. "See," he announced, "everyone has a place, and when people know their place, society functions." Leo reached out and began to wipe the senator's shoe. The senator didn't move his foot. He just stood there sipping his wine, looking down at my son's head like he was a piece of furniture. I looked for Rachel. I needed to see her. I needed to know if there was any humanity left in her soul. I found her standing near the ice sculpture, a glass of champagne in her hand. Her face was pale like wax. She was watching her husband, the father of her child, kneeling on the floor, being humiliated by her father. Her friends were whispering in her ear, giggling. Rachel looked at them. She looked at Leo. And then she took a sip of champagne and turned her back. She turned around to talk to a woman in diamonds, laughing at something she said. That was the moment. That was the death of the marriage. I saw Leo look up. He saw her back. He saw the rejection. And in his eyes, the light of love went out, replaced by the cold steel gray of a titan. He finished wiping the shoe. He stood up. He folded the dirty napkin and placed it in his pocket. He looked at Richard. "Is there anything else?" Sir Leo asked. His voice was steady. It did not shake. It was the voice of a man who has walked through fire and found he does not burn. Richard looked disappointed. He wanted tears. He wanted begging. He wanted Leo to break. The fact that Leo was standing there calm and collected infuriated him. He stepped close to Leo, invading his personal space. He hissed so only Leo could hear, but I was close enough to read his lips. He said, "You are nothing. You are dirt. I took your son, I took your wife, and now I have taken your pride. You should have stayed in the gutter with your father." Leo looked him in the eye. He smiled. It was the same smile I had given Richard earlier that day, a smile that promised retribution. He said, "I am just taking out the trash, Richard. Someone has to do it." Richard raised his hand. He was going to slap him. He was going to hit a servant in the middle of a charity gala. He was losing control. The facade of the civilized businessman was cracking, revealing the thug underneath. But before his hand could connect, the double doors at the far end of the ballroom flew open with a bang that shook the walls. A hush fell over the room. The music stopped. Every head turned. Running into the room was Richard's personal assistant, a young woman named Sarah, who looked like she had just seen a ghost. She was clutching a tablet to her chest, her heels clicking frantically on the floor as she ran toward the podium. She ignored the guests. She ignored the protocol. She ran straight to Richard, breathless and pale. "Mr. Harrington." She gasped, her voice carrying in the silent room. "Mr. Harrington, you have to come. Immediately." Richard lowered his hand, glaring at her. "Not now, Sarah. Can't you see I am in the middle of a lesson?" She grabbed his arm, shaking him. "No, sir. You don't understand. Security just radioed from the lobby. They are here." Richard pulled his arm away, brushing off his suit jacket. "Who is here?" "The police. I told you to keep the riffraff out." Sarah shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "No, sir. It is not the police. It is the helicopter. It just landed on the roof." Richard frowned. "Helicopter? I didn't authorize a landing." "Who is it?" Sarah swallowed hard. She whispered, but in the silence it sounded like a scream. "It is the chairman, sir. The chairman of Titan Holdings. Mr. W. He is in the elevator. He is coming up right now." The color drained from Richard's face so fast, it looked like the blood had simply evaporated. He staggered back a step. The glass of whiskey slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor, splashing amber liquid onto his pristine white shoes. "Titan Holdings," he whispered. "The chairman is here." "Personally." Sarah nodded. "They say he is here to discuss the debt structure." "Sir, he brought the acquisition team." Richard looked around the room. The panic was setting in. He knew what this meant. He knew he was $50 million in the hole to Titan. If the chairman was here, it wasn't for a social call. It was for an execution. He looked at Leo. For a second, he looked confused, as if trying to remember why he was angry at the waiter when the god of finance was knocking at his door. He shoved Leo hard in the chest. "Move!" Richard shouted. "Get out of my way! Get out of sight! If the chairman sees trash like you in my ballroom, he will think I run a zoo. Go back to the kitchen and stay there." Richard kicked Leo's leg, trying to physically drive him away. "Go hide yourself." Then Richard turned to the crowd. He put on a mask of desperate manic joy. He clapped his hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," he shouted, his voice cracking. "This is a momentous occasion, an incredible surprise. The chairman of Titan Holdings, the most reclusive billionaire in America, has graced us with his presence. This proves the strength of our partnership. Please clear the way, clear the floor." He began running toward the main doors, smoothing his hair, fixing his tie, practicing his bow. He was like a court jester, running to greet the emperor, terrified and eager all at once. Rachel ran after him, fixing her dress, putting on her best smile. The senator and the bankers straightened their jackets, all of them desperate to be seen to be near the power that was about to walk through those doors. The room transformed. The arrogance vanished, replaced by a palpable fear and subservience. They were all lining up, creating a path of honor for the guest. Leo stood alone in the center of the empty dance floor. He watched them run. He looked at the spot where Richard had kicked him. He dusted off his pants. I walked over to him. I stood beside him. I handed him the black folder I had been keeping warm against my chest. I said, "They are clearing the floor for the chairman, Leo." Leo took the folder. He looked at the doors where Richard was standing, practically vibrating with anticipation. I unbuttoned my polyester vest. I loosened my cheap tie. I said it would be rude to keep them waiting. Leo looked at me. He smiled. He said, "After you, Mr. Chairman." I shook my head. I put my hand on his back. I said, "No, son. Tonight we walk together." And as the heavy oak doors began to creak open, revealing the phalanx of security guards and lawyers standing in the hallway, I saw Richard's face light up with hope. He had no idea he was looking at his own reflection in the blade of a guillotine. He had no idea that the man he was waiting for was already standing behind him, holding a pitcher of water and a grudge that was worth $50 million. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the hush that fell over the ballroom was absolute. Richard was beaming, his face flushed with the anticipation of salvation. His eyes fixed on the hallway where he expected a stranger in a suit to appear. He expected a savior. He expected a checkbook. Instead, he saw me. I walked through the doors first. I had unbuttoned the cheap polyester vest and let it hang open, revealing the bespoke shirt underneath. I had untied the clip-on bow tie and let it dangle around my neck. I was holding the pitcher of ice water in one hand, not as a tool of service, but as a weapon of disrespect. Beside me walked Leo, clutching the black folder to his chest like a holy book. And behind us, filling the hallway like a storm front, was a phalanx of 12 men in dark suits. These were not catering staff. These were corporate security and federal agents. Richard's smile faltered. He blinked, trying to make sense of the data his eyes were sending him. He saw the waiter. He saw the janitor. He saw the men he had just ordered to the kitchen. He took a step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of confusion. He shouted, "What is this security? Get these clowns out of here! I am waiting for the chairman." Catherine stepped out from behind the wall of security guards. She walked past me, her heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. She walked straight to the podium where Richard had been standing moments ago. She tapped the microphone. The feedback squeal made everyone wince. She looked at Richard, who was now frozen halfway between the stage and the door. She looked at the crowd of baffled millionaires. Her voice was cool, amplified, and deadly. She said, "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. There has been a misunderstanding regarding the guest of honor. Mr. Harrington believes he is waiting for a stranger. But the chairman has been here all night." She swept her arm toward the door. Toward me. She said, "It is my distinct honor to introduce the founder and majority shareholder of Titan Holdings, the owner of the debt, the owner of this building, and as of tonight, the owner of Harrington Luxury. Please welcome Mr. Warren Fitzgerald." The silence that followed was not the silence of respect. It was the silence of a vacuum, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Richard looked at me. He looked at Catherine. He looked back at me. His mouth opened and closed like a fish on a dock. He whispered, "No. That's the janitor. That's Leo's dad. He fixes toilets." I handed the water pitcher to a passing security guard. I walked into the room. I did not walk like an old man with arthritis. I walked like a man who moves mountains for a living. I walked straight to the stage. The crowd parted for me, their eyes wide, their whispers rising like steam. I climbed the steps to the podium. Richard was standing there, shaking. He tried to block me. He put a hand on my chest. He hissed, "You can't be up here. This is my party. Get down before I..." I didn't let him finish. I grabbed his wrist. I didn't twist it. I just squeezed. I squeezed with the grip strength of a man who spent 40 years turning wrenches on rusted pipes. Richard gasped. His knees buckled. I removed his hand from my chest and dropped it like a dead fish. I stepped up to the microphone. I looked out at the sea of faces. I saw the senator who had tried to get my son to wipe his shoes. He was pale, trying to hide behind a potted plant. I saw the bankers who had laughed at Richard's jokes. They were checking their phones, probably selling their Harrington stock. And I saw Rachel. She was standing by the ice sculpture, her hand over her mouth, looking at me as if I were a ghost. I spoke. My voice was low, gravelly, the voice of the earth itself. I said, "Richard Harrington likes to talk about bloodlines. He likes to talk about worth. He told my son this morning that he wasn't worthy to sit at his table. He told him that his blood was dirty. He told him he was trash." I looked at Richard. He was leaning against the wall, breathing hard sweat pouring down his face. I continued, "So I decided to come here tonight to see what a worthy bloodline looks like. And what did I find? I found a man who hasn't paid his employees in 3 months. I found a man who leverages his company to pay his gambling debts. I found a man who kicks his own grandson out onto the street to hide his own failures." Richard screamed, "That's a lie, he's lying. He's just a bitter old man, security." I nodded to Catherine. She typed a command into her tablet. The massive screens behind the stage, which had been displaying the Harrington Luxury logo, flickered and changed. A spreadsheet appeared. It was complex, filled with numbers, but the red ink was unmistakable. I said, "This is your balance sheet, Richard. You owe Titan Holdings $50 million. You owe the IRS $12 million. You owe your suppliers $8 million. You are not a tycoon. You are a fraud." The crowd gasped. Phones were raised, recording everything. Richard lunged for the screen as if he could physically block the truth. A security guard caught him by the arm and held him back. I said, "But money is just paper. Money can be lost and made again. Character is what matters. And Richard, your character is bankrupt." I signaled Catherine again. The screen changed. This time it wasn't a spreadsheet. It was a video. It was grainy black and white footage from a security camera. It showed the front driveway of the Harrington estate from earlier that day. It showed a pile of garbage bags. It showed Richard standing on his porch holding a golf club. It showed him kicking a small stuffed teddy bear into a mud puddle. It showed him laughing as my son fell to his knees to retrieve it. Then the video cut to another angle. It was inside the house. It showed Richard grabbing Toby by the arm. My grandson was crying. Richard was shaking him, yelling at him to stop whining, telling him that his father was a loser and he needed to grow up. It showed him dragging the boy to the door and shoving him outside. The sound in the ballroom changed. It went from shock to revulsion. A woman in the front row covered her eyes. A man shouted, "You monster!" Rachel stared at the screen. She had been there. She had seen it happen. But seeing it played back 10 feet tall in high definition seemed to break something inside her. She let out a sob and collapsed to her knees, her beautiful blue dress pooling around her like a puddle of water. I looked at Richard. He wasn't fighting anymore. He was staring at the screen, his face slack. He knew. He knew it was over. I said, "You called my son unworthy. You said he was dirt. But look at the screen, Richard. Who is the dirt? Who is the man who abuses a 6-year-old boy because he is too weak to face his own mistakes, huh?" I turned back to the crowd. I pointed at Leo, who was standing tall near the stage, still holding the foreclosure documents. I said, "That man there, the one you treated like a servant, the one you humiliated for sport, he is the new CEO of this company. Because he knows the value of hard work, he knows the value of loyalty, and he knows that you never ever hurt a child." I looked at Leo. I said, "Finish it, son." Leo walked up the steps. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Richard. He walked over to him and held out the black folder. He said, "Richard Harrington, you are in default. Pursuant to the covenants of your loan agreement with Titan Holdings, we are exercising our right to immediate foreclosure. We are seizing all assets, including this building, your inventory, and your personal estate, which was used as collateral." Leo placed the folder in Richard's trembling hands. He said, "You have 1 hour to vacate the premises. You may take 1 box of personal items. Anything else belongs to us." Richard dropped the folder. It hit the floor with a heavy slap. He looked around the room looking for an ally, looking for anyone who would stand up for him. But the sharks smelled blood. They turned away. They checked their watches. They were already calculating how to distance themselves from the blast radius. Richard looked at me. His eyes were wet. He whispered, "Warren, please. We're family. You can't do this. I'm an old man." Where will I go? I stepped closer to him. I leaned in so only he could hear, but the microphone picked up every word. I said, "You can go to the park, Richard. There's a nice bench there. It's where I found my son this morning." Suddenly, the doors at the back of the room opened again. 4 men in windbreakers walked in. On the back of their jackets in bright yellow letters it said FBI. They walked through the crowd, purposeful and grim. They walked straight to the stage. One of the agents stepped up to Richard. He flashed a badge. He said, "Richard Harrington." Richard nodded, unable to speak. The agent said, "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of securities fraud, embezzlement, and wire fraud. We also have a separate warrant for child endangerment." The agent spun Richard around. He pulled Richard's arms behind his back. The sound of handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the silent ballroom. It was a harsh mechanical sound, the sound of justice. Richard started to cry. He wailed, "No, I'm Richard Harrington. I'm a pillar of the community. You can't do this, Rachel, tell them." Rachel didn't look up. She was still on the floor, weeping into her hands. She didn't move to help him. She didn't say a word. She let them take him. The agents dragged Richard off the stage. He kicked and screamed, his dignity gone, his legacy destroyed. They marched him past the guests, past the cameras, past the buffet tables he couldn't pay for. As they passed me, I looked at him one last time. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to see the janitor. I leaned into the microphone. My voice boomed through the hall. I said, "Richard." He looked back, his face a mask of terror. I said, "You were right about one thing. Bloodlines matter. But you got it wrong. Bloodline doesn't determine class. Money doesn't determine class. Character determines class. And you have none." The agents pushed him through the doors, and he was gone. The ballroom was silent. The guests stood frozen, unsure of what to do. They had come for a party, and they had witnessed an execution. I looked at Leo. He was standing on the stage watching the empty doorway. He looked tired. He looked sad. But he was standing. I put my hand on his shoulder. I turned him away from the door. I turned him toward the future. I said, "Come on, son. We have a company to rebuild, and we have a little boy to bring home." We walked off the stage together. We walked past the silent crowd. We walked past Rachel, who was still crying on the floor. Leo paused for a second. He looked down at her. He didn't offer her a hand. He didn't offer her comfort. He just looked at her with a quiet finality. He realized that the woman he loved had died a long time ago, killed by her own greed. We walked out of the ballroom through the kitchen and out into the cool night air. The helicopter was waiting on the roof of the tower, but for now we just stood on the sidewalk. I took off my tie. I undid the top button of my shirt. I took a deep breath. It smelled of rain and exhaust, but to me, it smelled like victory. Leo looked at me. He smiled. It was a real smile, the first one I had seen in days. He said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah, son." He said, "Can we get a burger? I'm starving." I laughed. It was a loud, happy sound. I said, "Yeah, Leo. We can get a burger. We can get anything we want." We walked down the street, two men in waiter uniforms leaving the ruins of an empire behind us. We didn't look back. We didn't need to. We knew who the real bosses were, and we knew that tomorrow the real work would begin. 3 days after the gala, the silence outside the courthouse was not heavy, it was clean. It felt like the air after a long fever breaks. I leaned against the hood of my truck, watching the heavy doors of the family court building. I was back in my flannel shirt and jeans. The Italian suit was hanging in the closet again, waiting for the next war, but I hoped I would never have to wear it again. The door opened, and Leo walked out. He was holding Toby's hand. My grandson was squinting in the sunlight, holding that muddy teddy bear that we had washed 3 times, but still smelled faintly of the earth. When Toby saw me, he let go of his father's hand and ran. He hit my legs with the force of a cannonball, burying his face in my stomach. I knelt down and hugged him, smelling the shampoo in his hair and the innocence that we had fought so hard to protect. Leo walked toward us. He looked tired, but he walked with a new rhythm. It was the walk of a man who knows he can protect what is his. He had just been granted full legal custody. Richard was being held without bail due to flight risk and the mountain of federal charges against him. The judge had looked at the video evidence from the gala, the footage of the abuse, and made the decision in less than 10 minutes. But as we turned to leave, a voice called out from the bottom of the steps. It was Rachel. She looked like a ghost of the woman I had seen at the party. Her hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, and she was wearing a simple gray dress that looked like it came off a clearance rack. She looked small. She looked like she was trying to be the girl Leo had fallen in love with 7 years ago, before the money and the expectations had twisted her into her father's daughter. Leo stopped. He told Toby to go sit in the truck with Grandpa. I picked the boy up and put him in the cab, handing him a bag of pretzels. I closed the door, but I didn't get in. I leaned against the fender, crossing my arms. I wanted to see this. I needed to see if my son would hold the line. Rachel walked up to Leo. She didn't try to touch him. She stood 3 feet away, twisting a ring on her finger. It wasn't her wedding ring that was gone. It was a cheap silver band. She said, "Leo, please. You have to talk to me. I have nowhere to go. The feds seized the house. My accounts are frozen. Daddy is in jail. I am sleeping on my friend's couch." Leo looked at her. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked sad. He said, "I am sorry, Rachel. That sounds very hard." She stepped closer, her eyes filling with tears. She said, "I was scared, Leo. You know how he is. You know how my father gets. I didn't want to hurt you. I was just trying to survive him. I thought if I played along, he wouldn't hurt Toby. Please, you know me. You know I love you. We can start over. We can go away somewhere, just the 3 of us." It was a good performance. It was almost convincing. But Leo had seen behind the curtain. He had seen her sip champagne while he was on his knees. Leo shook his head slowly. He said, "No, Rachel. You weren't trying to survive. You were trying to win. You bet on the wrong horse. You thought your father was the power, and I was the peasant. You made a calculation just like he did." Rachel sobbed, reaching out to grab his hand. She said, "I made a mistake. Please, Leo. I am the mother of your child. You can't just leave me with nothing." Leo pulled his hand away. He stepped back. He said, "You aren't leaving with nothing, Rachel. You are leaving with exactly what you brought to the table. Your bloodline. Your name. That is what you valued, right? That is what you told me was so important. Well, now you have it all to yourself." He turned his back on her. She screamed his name. She screamed that he was cruel. She screamed that he was just like her father. Leo stopped. He turned his head slightly. He said, "No, Rachel. If I were like your father, I would destroy you. I would sue you for emotional distress. I would make sure you never worked again. But I am not him. I am a Fitzgerald, and we don't kick people when they are down. We just leave them there." He walked away. He got into the truck and closed the door. He didn't look back at the woman weeping on the sidewalk. He looked at his son. He touched Toby's hair. I climbed into the driver's seat. I started the engine. I looked at Leo. I asked, "Are you okay, son?" Leo took a deep breath. He exhaled slowly, letting go of 7 years of toxicity. He said, "Yeah, Dad. I am okay. Let's go home." 1 month later, the sun was shining on the glass facade of the building that used to be the headquarters of Harrington Luxury. The sign above the door had been removed, leaving a ghost outline of letters on the stone. A new sign was being hoisted into place. It read, "Phoenix Logistics, a subsidiary of Titan Holdings." I stood on the sidewalk with Leo. He was wearing a new suit. It wasn't Italian wool, it was a practical navy blue off the rack, but he wore it better than any bespoke garment because he had paid for it with his own paycheck. I handed him a set of keys. Not the keys to a car, but the keys to the building. I said, "This is it, Leo. The auditors are done. The fraud has been cleared out. The debt has been restructured. It is a clean slate. It is not a gift. It is a job." Leo took the keys. He looked up at the building. It was smaller than the Titan Tower, but it was solid. It had good bones. He said, "I won't let you down, Dad. I am going to run this place right. Honest books, fair wages, no more lies." I nodded. I said, "I know you will, because you know what happens when you build on sand. You have seen the crash. You have the scar tissue now. That makes you a better leader than a man who has never bled." He asked me, "What about you? Are you coming back to the office?" "Catherine says the board misses you." I laughed. I looked down the street at my old truck parked at the curb. The rust was still there, but under the hood was a brand new engine I had installed myself over the weekend. A powerful modern heart in an old beaten body. I said, "No, son. My time in the boardroom is done. I came back to fight a fire, not to sit behind a desk. Catherine can handle the empire. She knows how I think." Leo asked, "So what are you going to do?" I smiled. I looked at the horizon where the highway stretched out toward the coast. I said, "I am going to drive. I am going to see the ocean. I am going to visit those national parks your mother and I always talked about, but never had the time to see." "I have a lot of money," Leo and I realized something during this fight. He asked, "What is that?" I said, "Money is useless if you don't have time to spend it. I spent 40 years building a fortune to protect my family. Now my family is safe. You are safe. Toby is safe. The job is done." I hugged him. It was a tight, fierce hug. I felt the strength in his back. He was not the soft boy I had found on the park bench. He was a man made of iron. I walked to my truck. I climbed in. The seat creaked, a familiar welcome. I rolled down the window. Leo stood on the sidewalk holding the keys to his future. Toby was standing next to him, holding my hand through the open window. Toby asked Grandpa, "When will you be back?" I squeezed his little hand. I said, "I will be back for Christmas, kid. And I am going to bring you a real bear. Not a stuffed one. A carving. I am going to whittle it myself by a campfire." I put the truck in gear. The new engine purred, a low, powerful rumble that shook the frame. I looked at Leo one last time. I said, "Remember, Leo, you are the boss. Not because of the name on the building, but because you survived the fire. Never let anyone tell you your blood isn't worthy. Your blood is gold." Leo smiled. He saluted me. He said, "Drive safe, Dad." I pulled away from the curb, merging into the traffic. I watched them in the rearview mirror until they were just specks in the distance. My son and my grandson standing in front of their legacy. I turned on the radio. It was playing an old country song. I rolled the window down further, letting the wind hit my face. I felt light. I felt free. I drove past the park where this whole nightmare had started. I saw the bench where I had found them. It was empty now, just a piece of wood and metal. But to me it was a monument. It was the place where I had decided to stop hiding. I drove out of the city, past the suburbs, past the industrial parks I owned. I hit the open highway. The road stretched out before me, a gray ribbon leading to anywhere I wanted to go. Richard Harrington was in a cell. Rachel was in a studio apartment learning how to budget for groceries. And I was in a 20-year-old Ford truck with a billion-dollar engine heading west. Justice had been served. The balance had been restored. And the world finally knew that you should never judge a book by its cover, and you should never judge a man by his truck. Because sometimes the man in the flannel shirt isn't a peasant. Sometimes he is the king in exile. And when he returns, he doesn't bring a checkbook. He brings a hammer. My name is Warren. I am 70 years old, and I am just getting started. Through the wreckage of betrayal and the triumph of justice, I learned that true power doesn't roar. It whispers. It isn't found in a bank account or a title, but in the quiet strength to stand up when everyone expects you to kneel. My son learned that day that a man's worth isn't measured by the brand of his suit, but by the integrity of his spine. We walked away from the hollow glitz of the Harrington Empire, not just with our dignity intact, but with the profound understanding that the only legacy worth building is one of character, loyalty, and the unshakable bond of a family that fights for each other. What would you have done in my shoes? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice served, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life dramas. Don't forget to tell me where you're watching from. See you in the next story.